Hi and welcome to Matt's Workshop. In this short video series I'd like to present to you a project that I've been working on in the last few months. It actually started during the pandemic and I'm still working on it today. So it took me a few months of designing on my CAD software to come up with something that I liked, followed by several months of building and shooting everything to be able to produce this video. If you enjoyed that kind of content, please follow along and don't forget to like and subscribe. First, I'm going to present to you the different features that I have integrated into the Workbench. So as you see it, you see the Workbench from the, let's say, the power tool side perspective. So the first tool that I have integrated is the table saw. The table saw I own is the DeWalt DW745. Just on the left you have the router lift. Then both the table saw and the router will be sharing the common saw fence that you see here, which is a custom design. The saw box will contain the table saw itself and will give access to it when we want to remove it from the workbench. And both power tools will also be controlled by a common control panel, on which there is two different safety switches. On the opposite side of the control panel, I have the right panel that is just meant to receive some tools that I can hang up on some hooks or things like that. And just beside it, you can see the right toolbox. If you look at the workbench from what I call the work holding side perspective, you can see that we have another toolbox, which I call the left toolbox. We also have the router box that contains the router lift itself. Then there's the vent collector system that I can use to collect the dust from either machine. And now more specifically on the work holding features, we have first the face vise, then we have the inset vise, which is a little bit like a tail vise. And then I have a dead man and several different dog holes in various positions across the workbench. I also had several other constraints I wanted to consider. So first I wanted the workbench to be on retractable casters. I wanted it to be very heavy. I wanted it to be at a height of about 38 inches, which I find comfortable. And I wanted it to be as narrow as possible, as long as it accommodates the tools that I needed. I wanted it to be about 1500 millimeters long. I wanted one single 120 volt power cord. And I wanted every possible voids to be turned as much as possible, at least into some sort of storage. To integrate the table saw, I did not want to have to cut the front of the frame to keep its rigidity, so I decided to go with a design where the table saw would be held in a box that could lower down, and there will be a drawer that you could extend out of it to remove the table saw comfortably. You can see some renders of the frame here as we move on to the beginning of the build. The first step is to cut all the pieces to their rough sizes, and to do that I use a combination of the track saw and the table saw. The first component I'm going to build are the legs, and pretty much every sub-component of the legs are made the same way. So I have different raw material that were cut with and they have a little bit of extra length. So now, as you see here, I just make sure that everything is square and cut them to the length that I need. Now that I have all the pieces cut to length, I can start to work on the different cuts I need to do in every single component. The workbench is going to be built using some joinery, and I found it much easier for me to cut every single component individually instead of trying to cut a very large holes in a very big beam of plywood, which is very hard to cut. So I lay down every measurements and I take a knife to scribe every line that I need to cut to make sure that I have a clean cut close to the lines. Then onto the press drill, where I can start to drill some holes in the corners of all the openings I need to cut. And now it's just a matter of following the lines on the scroll saw, and I have a pretty good surface finish on those cuts, and it's going to be relatively precise, although I do expect that once all the components are laminated, I will have some corrections to do. Once every cuts are finished, it's time to start gluing all the pieces together. I first apply a good amount of glue and then I spread it out with the silicone roller. I can now place all the components together and align them as well as I can at this moment and start to apply some clamps. And I always check back and forth to make sure that all the components are aligned and that I'm pretty square with the table. I repeated the same process for all the legs and I let them set for a few days. Now I can remove the clamps. I now start to work on the braces that will link two legs together. The gluing and clamping process is exactly the same as you saw before, although this time I will have several cuts to do after the pieces are glued together. I now go back on the legs for a second here on the table saw where I cut them to their final width. I made sure to have some over material here to be able to cut them square and true once they're all assembled and laminated. And I also need to cut them to their final length. I quickly use the hand plane to make a little bit of a chamfer to help engage all the components together on assembly. And of course, here's a first test fit that reveals that the components don't necessarily fit as expected together. So I will need to remove some material. You will see here I start by scribing the material I want to remove with a knife, and I use a chisel to slowly remove a layer of plywood. I can now confirm that everything fits very well together. This is a very satisfying part of the process. And then I make sure everything is square, so I guarantee that the components fit as I expect, and I can now start to work on different other cuts. And here it is on the braces. I start by cutting those little squares I need to remove in the corners on the miter saw. And I finish all the cuts with the Japanese handsaw. And here's a very satisfying moment where I can start to take all the components of the leg and assemble them together. So this is what you see me doing here. And I will be checking the squareness of the frame to confirm that everything is great. And now I can start to glue all the components together for a final assembly. Now that the legs hold themselves together and I can manipulate them comfortably, I will start to pre-drill all the holes I need to install the casters at the bottom of the legs. You can see here those two legs pretty much finished, and I can start to work now on both the top and bottom cross frames that I have that link both legs together to form the frame. Again, here several cuts are needed to accommodate the joinery and the pegs that I will install on the top of the legs to hold the tabletop. That's what you see me doing here, and when all the cuts are made, I can glue all the components together. So as you see here, I have the small cross braces of these top and bottom frames, and here are all the parts of the top cross frame. And as I mentioned, the top of the work frame is going to be located and held in place using some pegs on the top of the cross frame. So here you see me cutting them and assembling them with glue. Now that these pegs are glued together, this brings me to the next step on the frame. You can see a glimpse here of the frame pre-assembled, and I now start to drill the holes I will need to install the long bolts and barrel nuts to hold the frame together. Once all these holes are pre-drilled, I disassemble the frame, and on the end of every cross frame I need now to drill cross holes to accommodate the barrel nuts that I use for assembly. When this is done, I install all the barrel nuts in place, and I use a little bit of hot glue to hold them in place. And I install a screw to make sure that while the glue sets, that the barrel nuts are in the right position. And now I start to work on the tabletop. You can see the first component here with the cuts that I need to do all laid out. This tabletop is made of a shell of 17mm plywood, which is going to be filled with MDF. For all the cuts you see me do here, I work the same way, so I scribe the line with a knife, and then when I come back with the router to finish the cut, I'm sure that I'm not gonna tear out any fibers. Then I remove some material with the chisel to establish the edge. I also have several holes I need to make all across the top surface, so at this stage I take a small drill bit and I pre-drill all of them. On what is going to be the router lift opening, you see me use a Fastener bit to establish the corners of a cut I need to make with the router. Using a 3/4 inch Fastener bit, I now start to drill all the dog holes I laid out all across the surface. For the very large cuts that are all the way through, I start by removing most of the material with a jigsaw. Now that most of the material have been removed, I can install some fences and use the router to finish the cuts. As I mentioned, the workbench top is going to be a shell of plywood, so I will need to install strips on the side of this panel here. That's why it's cut at 45 degrees. I've pre-cut everything with a circular saw, but now I need to bring it to a sharp edge with a router. That's what you see me doing here. Here I start to work on those side strips. They have been cut to 45 degree lengthwise. And here I also need to cut the tips at 45 degrees. Now that these strips are ready, I can start to glue them on the workbench top. And to do so, I use a nail gun to hold everything in place. For the MDF material filler, I've pre-cut the first panel to fit inside the shell, and I will lay it down there so I can go from underneath and pre-trace all the cuts I need to make on the MDF. And I also transfer any mounting holes I need. Then I remove the panel from the shell and I pre-drill the corners of every cut I need to make. Then I use the jigsaw to cut all around. For the second layer, I didn't care if the MDF wasn't filled all the way, so I just used some scraps I had around to fill the voids. And I did not film the third layer because it's very similar to the first one. Now that the filler material is ready, I can install it in the plywood shell, and I do so by applying glue first, and then I lay down a panel and fix it in place with a nail gun. And I just do the same thing for every layer. And this is the workbench top almost finished and ready to be assembled. And here's another very satisfying moment where I need to reassemble the frame together to install the top on it and finish some operations. I can now install the top on the frame, and I can transfer the 6 mounting holes in the pegs underneath them, and then I will have to remove the top again to finalize these holes. And just like I did for the cross frame, I installed the barrel nuts in the pegs and set them in place with some hot glue. And I can place the top in its location again and finally fix it with the mounting screws. And this completes the first assembly of the workbench frame. This is it for this video, but there will be more to come in this workbench build series. So stay tuned for next, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And thanks for watching!